The dress was already made. That is the thing I think about when I think about how it started. Not a conversation, not a question, not even a formal announcement. The dress was already made, hanging in my mother's cedar chest, folded in tissue paper, finished down to the last pin, before anyone had asked me a single thing about my own future. I was 19 years old, and somewhere between my 18th birthday and the morning I found that dress, a decision had been made about my life that did not include my voice. I stood in front of that cedar chest for a long time. The fabric was plain, the way wedding dresses in our community were plain, dark blue, modest, without ornament. It was beautiful in the way that plain things are beautiful. It was also the most frightening thing I had ever seen, because what it told me, without a single word being spoken, was that the story of my life had already been written, that I was not the author of it, that someone else had been holding the pen all along. My name is Sarah. I was 20 when I got married, and what I am about to tell you tonight is not a story about a bad man or a cruel family. It is something harder than that. It is the story of a system so complete, so thoroughly woven into every part of daily life, that the people inside it could participate in something that looked, from the outside, like a choice, and feel, from the inside, that it was, while the actual choosing had happened long before anyone asked. I need to take you back. Not to the dress, further back than that, to the girl I was before I understood what was being built around me. I grew up in a deeply traditional old order community in Pennsylvania. My father was not a deacon or a bishop. He was a farmer, steady and quiet, a man whose authority in our household was complete in the way of something that has never been questioned and therefore never needed to defend itself. My mother was the kind of woman I have described before in other ways, faithful, capable, the particular piece of someone who has made their accommodation with the available and built something real inside it. They loved me. I do not doubt that. I have never doubted that. But love, inside the framework I grew up in, was not separate from expectation. It moved through the same channels that everything moved through: the Ordnung, the community, the bishop's quiet authority, the accumulated weight of what had always been done and would continue to be done because it had always been done. Love said, "We want what is best for you," and the framework said, "We already know what best looks like." These two things moved together so smoothly for so long that I did not understand they could be separated until the morning I found the dress. His name was Eli. He was 26. He had come to our district from a neighboring community in Ohio 2 years earlier, after his father's death, to take over the family land. He was quiet. He worked hard. He was respected by the men in our district in the way that a man who keeps to himself and does his work without complaint is respected. I had spoken to him perhaps 6 times in 2 years. 6 conversations, brief and public, and always in the presence of others, always on practical subjects. I did not know what made him laugh. I did not know what he was afraid of. I did not know what he thought about in the quiet of his own mind. I knew his name. I knew his land. I knew my father approved of him. The conversations, the real ones, the ones between families, had apparently been happening for months before I found the dress. Not secretly exactly. Nothing in our community was truly secret, but quietly. In the spaces where men discussed things that affected their households and their futures, and where the people most affected were not always in the room. My father and Eli's uncle and the deacon and my father again. The slow, careful, legitimate process by which a match was considered and approached and eventually established, a process that had a long and faithful history in our community and that had worked by its own measures for generations. I was not in those conversations, not because I was deliberately excluded, because my inclusion was not part of the framework. My consent was assumed in the way that many things were assumed, not maliciously, not through anyone's desire to harm me, but through the accumulated momentum of a way of doing things that had been the way of doing things for longer than anyone in my family had been alive. When my mother finally sat with me and told me, not asked me, told me, that Eli had expressed his intention and that the families were agreed, she said it with a warmth and a certainty that I recognized as genuine. She believed she was giving me good news. She believed she was telling me about something wonderful that had been arranged for me by people who loved me. Her face, when she spoke, had none of the discomfort that comes from doing something wrong. It had the particular satisfaction of someone who has done something right. I sat across from her at the kitchen table. The morning light was coming through the window in the particular way it came in late autumn, sideways, thin, making everything look slightly more serious than usual. My hands were flat on the table. I could feel the grain of the wood under my palms. I said, "When?" She said, "Spring." I said, "And if I said no?" The silence that followed was not long, maybe 4 seconds. But those 4 seconds contained something I had not seen on my mother's face before. Not anger, not hurt exactly. Something more like the look of someone who has been asked a question in a language they do not speak. A genuine blankness, as though the sentence I had said did not fully parse. As though the concept of my saying no was so outside the framework of what this conversation was supposed to be that she could not immediately locate it in her understanding of what was happening. Then she said, "Sarah, Eli is a good man. Your father approves. The families are agreed. This is a good match." She had not answered my question. She had replaced it with information that, inside the framework, made the question unnecessary. And I understood in that moment, with a clarity that was cold and complete, that the question I had asked was not one the framework had room for. That the framework had never had room for it. That the dress in the cedar chest existed because the room for that question had never been part of the design. I married Eli in the spring. The dress fit perfectly. The ceremony was long and full of hymns and the particular gravity of a community witnessing a covenant. Eli said his words steadily. I said mine. 300 people watched. The food was abundant. My mother cried in the way mothers cry at weddings, with a fullness that contained pride and grief and hope in equal measure. I stood in the center of all of it, and I felt something I did not have a name for yet. Not misery, not rebellion. Something quieter and more disorienting than either. The feeling of being a person who is living inside a story they did not write. Who is saying words that are true in one sense and not quite true in another. Who loves the people around them and is also, underneath that love, completely alone in a way that those people cannot see and would not know how to address if they could. That feeling did not leave. It stayed with me through the first year of my marriage and the second and into the third. Eli was not unkind. He was not the villain of this story. I want to be clear about that. The way I have wanted to be clear about it every time I have tried to tell this story. He was a man who had also been shaped by the same framework, who had also moved through a process he understood as legitimate and good, who had also arrived at this marriage through channels that did not require him to fully know me before choosing me. We were, in a strange way, equally shaped by the same thing, equally inside it, equally unable, from the inside, to see its full shape. By the third year, I could see the full shape. I saw it the way you see something that has always been there once you finally turn and face it directly, all at once, completely, with the slightly sick feeling of understanding something that cannot be ununderstood. The lie was not that anyone had deceived me. The lie was what the framework called the truth. It called my marriage a choice. It called my yes. The yes I had given without being properly asked. The yes that had been prepared and assumed before my voice was consulted. A willing commitment. It called the dress in the cedar chest love. And all of those things were true inside the framework. They were simply not the whole truth outside of it. I began, slowly and then less slowly, to separate those two things: the framework's truth and the whole truth. The story I had been given and the story I would have written. They were not entirely different, but they were not the same. The process of understanding the difference and what I did with that understanding is a longer story than I can finish tonight. What I will tell you is that the moment I stood at the kitchen table and asked my mother, what if I said no, and watched her face go blank with the blankness of someone encountering a language they do not speak, that moment was the beginning of something, not of leaving, not of anything dramatic or immediate, of knowing, of letting myself know what I had always, at some level, already known. You cannot unknow a thing once you have let yourself know it. That is both the gift and the cost of honesty. I want to ask you something tonight. Is there a story about your own life that someone else wrote? A role you were placed into before you were old enough to choose it? A framework you inherited that called itself truth? And if you were standing at your own kitchen table right now, with your hands flat on the wood, and someone asked you, what if you said no, what would your answer be? You are allowed to know the answer, even if knowing it changes things, especially then.